Okay, so who needs research? Hopefully you just read the article ahead of us. I mean, for this week, this is what we're talking about this week. Like, who needs this research? Well, if you're going to be a teacher, the answer is you. You do need this research. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of things here. So if you look at this, the federal perspective, yes, all programs funded by the federal government must be grounded in scientifically based research. Well, who do you think funds our schools? Yes, it's the states to some extent, but mostly it's the government. So the government puts money into our schools through our states, and our state puts it onto public schools. So when I say public, privates are a whole different ballgame. So yes, if you have a school and you are not using, scientifically based research that is sound, we're kind of going against the law. And that is so crazy, because how many teachers do you know that really do a lot of research? Probably not many. So there's people that have jobs out there. They're called educational psychologists and educational researchers. And I wrote his name down here. One of the best ones I found on YouTube is Dr. Daniel Willingham. And what he said in one of his YouTube videos is that, okay, so we've got the teachers teaching in our schools, and we've got the researchers doing the research. Who's in charge of getting that information from the researchers to the teachers in the school? There is nobody. So teachers, if you have time in your crazy busy schedules with all the things you're doing on in your day, how are you going to do research? It's tough. It is very tough. So because our schools are federally funded, our best practices have to be based in scientific research. So the characteristics of scientific research-based studies, they have to use a scientific method. They have to have been replicated. It can't be just like a one-hit wonder. They need to be generalized to a larger population, meaning that if we can use it for one school district, we can use it for all school districts. Meets rigorous standards. And then other studies, the programs point to the same conclusion. So it can't just be like these obscure experiments that have crazy outcomes at the end. We have to have it so it's very much the same as other programs. So I'm kind of hoping that video turned out better than it probably looked when I was doing it. So when I recorded this, I recorded over Dr. Bowman's, just because I wanted to make sure I had my 2 cents in this. This is important stuff. So who needs research? You do. Your students do. You are federally mandated by the government to use best practices in your classroom. Okay, so why is that even important? And I've said this before when I was talking to a couple of you, face-to-face on Zoom, is that when we have our background knowledge in our teaching experiences, what do? We rely on those default programs that we already have in place. But if that's not our best practices and that's not research-based, are we truly doing justice to the students that are in our classroom? For instance, if you have a reaction of anger, anytime something happens in your classroom that makes you mad, instead of taking that step back and knowing that's our best practice. So our default is to go to that anger and start being all yelling and judgy and whatever we're doing. So is that the best practice? No, it is not. But that's our default method, some of our default methods. And so if you're doing that and you're reactionary without having research-based practices kind of ingrained or already in your practice and your repertoire, that's what we're talking about. So think about where did your background knowledge come of teaching? Either from home or teachers that you've had in the past. And so if you've had teachers in the past that have continually done the same thing, then you will probably do the same thing as well. One of the examples that I remember is that when I was in 2nd grade, which was literally decades ago, we had a teacher who, instead of walking over to the children in the playground, would yell. I mean, just yell across the playground at these kids to stop running or stop running on the jump monkey bars, whatever it was, instead of walking over there to that. So then my first recess duty, what's my first instinct? These kids are jumping out of the swing. What am I going to do? Yell at them across the playground? That was my default. That's what I had learned. That's what I had known. And so as soon as I said that, I was like, oh, Annie, you got it. You got to stop doing that. And then instead of walking over to the children and okay, guys, can't do that. And then whether I got my point across better or worse, I know that yelling is not a best practice. So that's just an example. Hopefully that was helpful in some way. But the idea behind research is that you need to have it to do best practices in your classroom. And I'm sure you've all taken Ed 101, and at Ed 101 in Miles City, what I always teach is that it is your job to build relationships with students, and it's your job to know the curricula enough to teach it. So I've got 2 basic rules in EDU 101, and I'm going to tell them to you now because I think every education student needs to know them. You're responsible for building good relationships because students don't learn from people they don't like, point blank. 2, you are responsible for their learning. No questions asked. So if that child is struggling, you figure out how to help them. If they don't understand something, you figure out how to teach it differently. If they are not performing the way you think that they should, help, support, resource, guide, love. That's what we do. That's what we do as educators. So if you think about that in the research base, how am I going to make best connections with my students? There's a million different ways out there that people have done before you and then, are doing currently right now that are working. Find out what they are, best practices. Okay, how do I teach the content that I'm in, whether it's high school English, whether you're PE, whether you're elementary, whether you're kindergarten, doesn't matter. You have to know what those standards are and what you're going to be teaching. So then you can look at the research behind that and think, okay, so now I know what to teach. What is my best way of going about doing this? That is why you need research. It's federally mandated. It's best for the students. It's best for your school.